1 million logs. Picture that for a second. 1 million massive Douglas fir trunks, each one weighing up to a ton, stacked behind a wooden wall like bullets in a magazine. Then imagine opening a gate and watching all of it, an entire year's worth of timber, explode downstream in a churning, grinding wall of water and wood in 30 seconds. That wasn't a disaster. That was the plan. Western Oregon, 1890s. A timber industry facing bankruptcy unless it could solve one impossible problem: how to move mountains of logs from steep coastal forests down to mills 20, 30, sometimes 50 miles away. No roads existed. Railroads couldn't handle the terrain. Oxen died trying to haul even a fraction of what needed to move. But what if you could build a dam just to break it? What if you turned a quiet mountain stream into a freight train made of water? Between 1880 and 1957, timber companies constructed at least 232 documented splash dams across western Oregon alone. Hundreds more were built across Washington, Pennsylvania, Idaho, and Kentucky. Most operated for just a few seasons. Some broke apart on their first run. The men who worked them, the river pigs, faced drowning, crushing, and injuries that newspapers cataloged in dedicated sections. The question is, how did something this violent, this temporary, this dangerous, become the backbone of American lumber transport for nearly 80 years? Imagine standing in a coastal Oregon forest in 1885. You're surrounded by Douglas fir trees, 200 feet tall and 6 feet across, each one containing enough lumber to frame 8 houses. Your company just spent the winter cutting 50,000 of them. They're stacked in the logging camp, ready to go. The nearest sawmill is 30 miles downstream. You have oxen, you have wagons, you have determination. You have no way to move them. The first attempts were brutal. Timber companies tried dragging logs with ox teams down primitive skid roads, rough trails hacked through the forest. A single log required 4 to 6 oxen. The animals worked 14-hour days in mud that reached their bellies. In the winter of 1883 to 1884, the Cowieman River logging operations in Washington lost more than 30 oxen to exhaustion, broken legs, and accidents. Each animal cost $100, roughly $3,200 in today's money. Even when the oxen survived, the math didn't work. A team could haul maybe 4 logs per day. The 1885 season in Oregon's Coast Range required moving 20 million board feet of timber. At that rate, it would take 3 years to clear a single season's cut. And time meant rot. Logs left on the forest floor for more than one season began to decay. The sapwood turned soft. Insects moved in. What started as premium lumber worth $15 per 1,000 board feet became firewood worth pennies. Rivers seemed like the obvious answer. After all, wood floats. Just roll the logs into the creek and let nature do the work, right? Wrong. Natural stream flow in western Oregon's coastal mountains averaged 50 to 200 cubic feet per second in summer, barely enough to float a canoe, let alone thousands of tons of timber. Logs would wedge into bends, pile up on rocks, get stranded on gravel bars. A single stuck log could create a jam that backed up timber for a mile. The timber companies tried waiting for spring snowmelt, when water flow increased, but spring runoff was unpredictable. In some years it came early and caught companies unprepared. Other years it came late after contracts were already broken. And even in peak flow, the shallow streams of the Coast Range simply didn't have the volume to move industrial quantities of logs. One Pennsylvania timber operator named Joshua Smith calculated that natural river flow could move about 12% of his annual cut. The other 88% stayed in the woods, rotting. The financial stakes were enormous. In 1880, the Pacific Northwest timber industry employed 23,000 men directly and supported communities of another 75,000 people. If the logs couldn't reach the mills would close. If the mills closed, entire towns would vanish. Something had to change. The solution came from an unlikely place: beaver dams. And several logging foremen noticed that when natural beaver dams burst during spring floods, the rush of water carried everything downstream: logs, rocks, debris, the works. The sudden release created artificial flow many times stronger than the creek's normal current. What if you could build a dam specifically designed to do that? Not a permanent structure, not a dam meant to last decades. A dam built for one purpose: to be opened and unleash controlled chaos. The first documented splash dam in Oregon appeared on the Cowieman River in 1880. It was crude, just logs and rocks piled across a narrow gorge. But when the gate opened, it worked. Water that had been pooling behind the structure for weeks exploded downstream, carrying logs that had been stuck for months. The concept spread like wildfire through the timber industry. By 1885, dozens were under construction. By 1900, they were standard practice across the Pacific Northwest, the Northeast, and anywhere timber needed to move down mountain streams. But building a dam meant to break required completely rethinking what a dam could be. A splash dam was deceptively simple, which was precisely the point. The structure consisted of heavy logs laid horizontally, forming cribs that were then filled with boulders and dirt. Most were 50 to 150 feet wide, though some reached several hundred feet across narrow gorges. Height varied from 10 feet on smaller streams to 40 feet on major tributaries. The entire structure weighed anywhere from 200 to 800 tons. The key innovation was the sluice gate, a section of removable timbers or a hinged gate mechanism that could be opened to release the impounded water. Unlike permanent dams with controlled spillways, splash dam gates were designed to open completely and instantly. Behind the dam, a reservoir formed. Crews would spend weeks or even months stacking logs in the water and along the banks. The reservoir also had to be carefully sited. You wanted a location where the valley widened just enough to store massive amounts of water, but narrow enough that the dam didn't need to be prohibitively large. The physics were brutal but effective. When the gate opened, gravity did all the work. The stored water, often 20 to 50 acre-feet, weighing 30,000 to 80,000 tons, surged forward at velocities reaching 20 to 30 miles per hour. The logs, already floating, were simply swept along in the artificial flood. One Pennsylvania operator calculated that a single splash dam release could float as much timber in 6 hours as natural spring flow could move in 6 weeks. Opening a splash dam for the first time was terrifying. William McLeod, foreman of a splash dam on Oregon's Siletz River, described the 1892 inaugural run. "We pulled the pins at 6 a.m. The gate timbers came out slow at first, then one popped free, and the rest just exploded. The sound was like a cannon going off inside a cathedral. Then the water hit." He wasn't exaggerating. The release created a wall of water 8 to 15 feet high that roared downstream, with a sound witnesses compared to continuous thunder. Trees along the banks shook, animals fled. People downstream could feel the ground vibrate minutes before the flood arrived. The first releases often went wrong. Gates opened too fast and ripped themselves apart, sending the gate timbers downstream with the logs, useless wreckage that had to be rebuilt from scratch. Other times, the reservoir didn't hold enough water to carry all the logs, and half the timber got stranded anyway. The learning curve was steep and expensive. Early splash dams in Pennsylvania lost an estimated 30% of their logs to jams and strandings. The timber companies persisted because even losing 30% was better than losing 100%. But the real danger wasn't the dam. It was what came after. Splash dams killed in 3 distinct ways. The first danger was obvious: drowning. The wall of water and logs moved too fast to outrun. If you were downstream when the gate opened and didn't get to high ground, you simply vanished. Newspaper records from the 1890s document at least a dozen deaths from people caught in unexpected releases. Fishermen, hikers, workers who didn't get the warning. The second danger was crushing. Log jams formed when timber piled up at river bends or against boulders. Breaking a jam required men to walk out onto the mass of logs with peaveys, long poles with a spike and pivoting hook, and try to identify the key log holding everything in place. If you pulled the wrong log, or if the jam broke while you were still on it, thousands of tons of timber shifted instantly. You couldn't jump free. You went under. Thomas Henriksen, a Norwegian immigrant working Pennsylvania's Pine Creek in 1894, was 23 years old when a jam broke beneath him. His crew watched him disappear under the logs. It took 3 days to find his body. A crush between two 16-foot saw logs a quarter-mile downstream. In 1845, Ottawa Valley newspapers reported more than 80 deaths among log drivers in a single season. Most were young men in their 20s. Most couldn't swim, ironic for a job worked in water, but the third danger was the most insidious: complacency. Splash dams operated for years without incident, lulling workers into thinking they understood the risks. Then something would go wrong, a gate would fail at the wrong moment, a jam would form in a new location, water levels would be higher than expected, and men died. A single splash dam in north-central Pennsylvania floated 8 million board feet of logs in 1908. The crew celebrated. The next season, the same dam created a jam that killed 2 men and cost the timber company $40,000 in lost lumber, nearly $1.5 million today. The dangers were known. The work continued anyway. The men who worked splash dam log drives were called river pigs, river hogs, or catty men. They were a breed apart. A river pig's job required being nimble enough to run across floating logs in churning water, strong enough to wrestle timber with hand tools, and reckless enough to do it for 14 to 16 hours a day in water cold enough to cause hypothermia in minutes. Most couldn't swim. The paradox was intentional. Men who knew they couldn't save themselves in the water worked more carefully. Or so the foreman claimed. Pay reflected the danger. A typical lumberjack in the 1890s earned $1 to $1.50 per day. A river pig earned $2 to $3 per day, double the wage, equivalent to $80 to $120 per day in modern dollars. For the 4-month spring season, a skilled river pig could earn $300 to $400, more than many men earned in an entire year. The crews divided into specialized roles. The jam crew or beat crew consisted of the most experienced men. They moved ahead of the log mass, watching for places where jams might form. When a jam started, they rushed to it and tried to break it before it became catastrophic. This required reading the physics of moving logs, understanding which timber was load-bearing and which could be pulled safely. The rear crew or sacking crew followed behind, searching shorelines for logs that had gotten stranded. They worked with horses and teams, dragging timber back into the current. And scattered throughout were the peavy men, workers who spent all day in thigh-deep water, using their long poles to keep logs moving, unstick jammed timber, and guide the flow through narrow sections. Life in a log drive camp was primitive. Men slept in floating bunkhouses called wanigans, boats equipped with beds, a stove, and storage. They ate on another floating platform that served as a mobile kitchen. Everything moved downstream with the drive. The camps had one rule: no alcohol during the drive. A single drunk worker could get an entire crew killed. Anyone caught with liquor was fired on the spot and left wherever the wanigan happened to be. In some cases, that meant 30 miles from the nearest town. A typical splash dam log drive worked like this. Winter. Loggers cut timber and haul it to the creek banks upstream of the splash dam. The dam's gate stays closed, allowing the reservoir to fill with snowmelt and rain. Early spring, when water levels peak, crews move logs into the reservoir and arrange them for the drive. The goal is to pack as much timber as possible while ensuring it will all flow freely when released. Release day. At dawn, the crew positions itself along the river downstream. Scouts are sent miles ahead to watch for potential jam points. The foreman waits for the exact right moment, water levels high enough, downstream mills ready to receive. Then the gate opens. The first rush carries 60% to 80% of the logs. The rest follow in waves as water pulses through the reservoir. The drive continues for 4 to 6 days, with crews working around the clock to keep timber moving and break jams as they form. At the mill, boom crews use floating log barriers to catch the timber and sort it by ownership. But each company had its own end mark, a branded stamp on the log ends, similar to cattle brands in Texas. Altering or removing an endmark was a crime. The splash dam itself required constant maintenance. Each release damaged the structure, timbers loosened, rocks washed out, the creek bed below eroded. Crews rebuilt and reinforced between drives. Some dams lasted decades. Others failed after a single season. The scale was staggering. Pennsylvania's Pine Creek once floated 20 million board feet of logs in a single drive. Oregon's Cowieman River system operated 5 separate splash dams, coordinating releases to maximize flow. On Kentucky's Red River, a series of carefully timed releases from multiple dams moved drives of 35,000 to 50,000 logs up to 20 miles downstream. One drive on Kentucky's Red River created a jam 1 mile long. Between 1880 and 1957, splash dams moved billions of board feet of timber. In Oregon alone, the 232 documented splash dams transported enough lumber to build every house in a city the size of Portland. Twice over. The economic impact was transformative. Towns that didn't exist in 1880 became thriving communities by 1900, built entirely on splash dam logging. Hayward, Wisconsin, Priest River, Idaho, dozens of Pennsylvania mountain towns. Every store, every railroad, every school existed because splash dams made industrial-scale logging possible in terrain where nothing else worked. At its peak in 1906, the logging industry employed 500,000 lumberjacks across North America. A substantial portion of that workforce depended on splash dam operations for their livelihoods. But the cost was extraordinary. Splash dams destroyed river ecosystems. The violent floods scoured streams to bedrock, removing everything: plants, insects, fish habitat. Salmon runs that had existed for thousands of years were decimated. More than a century after the last splash dam operated, stream reaches in Oregon, where they were built, still show poorer habitat suitability for fish. The damage is visible today if you know what to look for. The human toll was equally stark. Newspaper archives from the 1880s through 1920s are filled with brief notices. River pig drowned breaking jam. 2 men lost in Clearwater Drive. Foreman crushed by logs. The exact death toll will never be known. Many deaths weren't reported. Families couldn't afford to travel to identify bodies. Men who vanished in the spring simply never came home. Splash dams began disappearing in the 1920s. Railroads expanded into logging territory, offering safer and more reliable transport. Logging trucks became practical with improved roads and engine technology. And crucially, the easy timber was gone. The massive old-growth stands near waterways had been cut. What remained was deeper in the mountains, in places no splash dam could reach. Environmental awareness played a role too. By the 1940s, state fisheries agencies recognized the catastrophic damage splash dams inflicted on salmon and steelhead populations. Lawsuits from downstream farmers whose land flooded during releases added legal pressure. Insurance companies balked at covering operations where death rates were measured in percentages rather than incidents. The last log drive on Idaho's Priest River ran in 1949. The last drive anywhere in Idaho happened in 1971, where on the Clearwater River, a symbolic end to nearly a century of splash dam operations. Some dams were dismantled, most were simply abandoned, left to decay in remote forest streams. A few were dynamited to restore fish passage, though by then the damage was generations deep. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find remnants. Near Dubois, Wyoming, the rusted remains of a splash dam still span a creek tributary. The timbers are gone, but the iron fittings and stone cribs mark where the structure stood. Tie hacks use this dam to float railroad ties down to the Laramie River. In Colorado's Old Roach area, another decaying splash dam sits forgotten in the forest. The gate mechanism is intact, frozen open, pointing downstream like an accusation. Oregon's coastal streams show the scars more subtly. The creek beds are wider than they should be, scraped clean by decades of artificial floods. Fish biologists can identify former splash dam sites by the absence of large woody debris and the simplified channel structure. The forest grew back. The streams never fully did. Some artifacts survive in museums. The Museum of North Idaho in Coeur d'Alene has peaveys, endmark brands, and photographs of river pig crews. The Priest River Timber Education Center maintains records of the splash dams that operated on local waterways. Pennsylvania's Lumber Museum in Gailton displays tools and documents the state's splash dam history. But the best record of splash dams exists in maps and archives. Rebecca R. Miller's 2010 Oregon State University thesis, Is the Past Present? Historical Splash Dam Mapping and Stream Disturbance Detection in the Oregon Coastal Province, documented all 232 known Oregon sites through exhaustive archival research. Her work revealed that many splash dams were never officially recorded, built by small operations, used for a season or two, then forgotten. The men are gone. Their tools are museum pieces. But the rivers remember. Splash dams represent everything complicated about American industrial history. They were brilliant, a simple, elegant solution to an impossible logistics problem. They were brutal, extracting maximum profit from both natural resources and human labor. They worked, moving timber no other method could touch, and they destroyed rivers, forests, ecosystems, and the men who worked them. Today, we build nothing like this. Our culture demands safety, environmental protection, sustainability. We wouldn't tolerate the death rates. We wouldn't accept the ecological damage. We wouldn't sacrifice men in their 20s to move lumber. But standing on the banks of a coastal Oregon stream where a splash dam once operated, it's hard not to feel something like awe. They built dams meant to break. They turned rivers into freight trains. They risked everything for timber that built cities, homes, and an industrial nation. The splash dam era is gone. The men who worked them are gone. What remains is just enough evidence to know it happened and to wonder at the audacity required to even try. If your family has stories about logging, river pigs, or splash dam operations, we'd love to hear them. The historical record is incomplete. And the best accounts often come from people whose grandparents or great-grandparents worked the drives. The era of splash dams is history now, preserved in archives, visible in scarred creek beds, remembered in museum exhibits. But the men who ran those drives, who walked on rolling logs in freezing water, who dynamited jams and rebuilt gates season after season, they left more than destruction. They left proof that humans will attempt the impossible if the stakes are high enough. And sometimes, incredibly, they succeed.